Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Happy Friday. I mean, we made it. We made it to this point. It's definitely an exciting day. And thank you for taking some time out on your lunch break or, in between Zoom calls. Thank you for joining us. Uh, my name is Olivia Livingston. I am the prevention coordinator at Peer Services. We are located downtown Evanston. And we have been hosting this parent webinar series for about a little over 4 weeks or so on a variety of topics to help parents, guardians, and individuals that are working with youth really focus on, cultivating and building relationships with teens. And specifically with this webinar, we're going to be talking about keeping the door open, okay? Talking about teens, about sexuality, gender, and relationships. Okay, so this is just meant for you to, gain some information on maybe even how to start a conversation with a teen and to build your knowledge around that. All right, and so just a reminder, if you are looking to have CEUs for this webinar, I will be sending an email after this presentation. And for those of you that are joining, and if you would like some CEUs, you can send the evaluation form back to myself, and then we will send you the certificate. Also, keep in mind, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, Lizzie will try to get to it right then. If not, then we will address it at the end of the webinar. All right, so without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and hand the mic off to Lizzie and let her introduce herself. Here you go, Lizzie.
Thank you. So hello, everybody who is here. It is delightful to be here. And somebody was like morning/afternoon. It is now afternoon. So on this Friday afternoon, I'm excited to be here with you. Again, my name is Lizzie Appleby. My pronouns are she and her. I am the Pride and Share Director at an organization called Youth Services. Just a little bit about Youth Services and who we are. We are a nonprofit organization based in Glenview. So we work with young people in a variety of different ways. A lot of what happens is in our space is individual and group counseling work. We do some crisis intervention and education and outreach, as well as some youth development programming. My role there is twofold. I oversee our Pride Youth program. So we work with LGBTQ+ young people ages 4 through 24 through social support and leadership programming, as well as supporting their families. And then my other job is to oversee our SHARE program, which is our sexuality education program. So we do workshops with young people as well as grown folks about how to support healthy sexual development for young people, sexual health, and healthy relationships. So as you can imagine, this workshop is a little bit of an intersection of both of those programs that I see, and really working on how do we have these conversations with young folks about these topics that can be really hard to talk about. The slides that I'm using are available online. You are welcome to access those. This link will also be at the end of the presentation. So if you don't want to write it down right now, you'll get it again. A reminder that since this is a webinar format, I can't see you or hear you, and no one else can either. Please do, if you have questions or responses to what I'm sharing, please do go ahead and put those in the chat. I have the chat up over my slides, so I can see what you're saying and can respond to that in a moment. So if I say something and you're like, this isn't clear, just feel free to be like, can you talk more about that? Or here's what's happening for me or whatever. And I'll speak into that as much as I can. I would love to get a sense of who's in the space and what folks are most hoping to get out of today. So we'll practice the chat right now. So if I could have folks go ahead and type in the chat the grade level of your child, if you're a parent, or if you are someone who works with young people or works with parents, if you could type in sort of the age group that you're working with. And then something that you're most hoping to learn today. Why did you select this webinar to go to? Why are you here? So I will give folks a second to go ahead and type that into the chat. And I'll highlight it for you so that it pops up. Awesome. So Olivia working with juniors and seniors mostly. 16 sophomore. Okay, better ways to communicate. Excellent. Excellent. Give folks another second to type in there. we've got a few people here today, so I'm hoping. Awesome. So 18 to 25, also focused on, also in a clinical mental health program with addiction, focused on how to start these conversations with young people, better ways to listen or communicate. Teens, hi Lisa, getting a different perspective from another professional, thanks. Awesome, so just different ways to talk with, looks like mostly high school students in this space and young adults, so that's helpful. I wasn't sure if we were going to have more leaning on the younger side or on the older side, so if you are a person with a teen who is a middle schooler in the space, feel free to drop that in the chat too, so I know you're here. But that's really helpful to hear where folks are. So plan for today, we'll talk a little bit about what I mean when I say creating an open door culture in your home. So what does that look like? Or right in your place of work, if you are working with young people, many of these apply there too. Talking about how we talk about healthy relationships and boundaries with young people. So how do we support young people in setting boundaries and navigating relationships? And we'll talk a little bit about sexual and gender identity development too, both in terms of your child who might be exploring their sexual and gender identity, or in terms of their peers, right? They might be around other folks who are expressing LGBTQ plus identities, and how do we support that as well? And then we will have lots of time for questions or conversations or scenarios that are coming up for folks as well. So let's dive in. So creating an open door culture. So how do we do this? And I'm going to think about it in two ways. One, in terms of sort of strategy. So like, what's the big picture a little bit? What's our strategy? But also in terms of tactics. So like, what do I actually say in the moment? And thinking about it that way. So when I say keep your door open, right, what I mean is, to give a visual metaphor, I tried to find a good graphic for this instead of my hands, but I couldn't find one, is that I often think of communication between parents and caregivers and their kids as sort of like two doors back to back. So one door here and one door here, right? And you as the grown person, you as the adult in the relationship, you have a door that you can keep open or that you can close. And your young person also has a door, right, that they can keep open or they can close. And so the key that we're talking about today is, as the adult, how do you keep your door open so that when, on the off chance, when the young person's door is open, when they're ready to communicate with you, they don't open their door to find a closed door waiting, right? They want to open their door so that you have an open door when their door is open too. Because the reality is, right, thinking developmentally for a second, young people, right, in adolescence are in the process of learning how to set boundaries, right? They're differentiating themselves, they're becoming their own person, and that's a good thing, right? We want them to grow into their own person. We want them to grow into successful adults, right, who are able to manage things on their own. And so that means they're going to slam their door in your face a bunch of times, right? So you keep your door open and they're constantly closing their door in your face. That sometimes doesn't feel great, right? Sometimes can feel hurtful, especially when we're transitioning into adolescence, where when our kids were younger, we might have had more experiences with an open door on two sides, right? And so it can be challenging to navigate that transition into sort of having that door, their door, be closed most of the time. But the goal, right, for adults is to keep our door open as much as we possibly can. And so how do we do that? And so some strategies for thinking about that, right? One is just like being available and willing to talk. We often imagine that we're going to have like a conversation with young people, right? Like we say, like, we're going to have the talk right now, or like, I'm going to talk with my kids today about sexual health, or I'm going to talk to my kids about dating violence, and then the conversation's over and then we're done with it. That's not how it is, right? It is many, many conversations that happen over many, many years. And so it's always important that when we end a conversation, that we don't end a conversation with our door closed, right? So you've had that open door conversation, and then, you know, they're like, all right, I'm done with you. And you keep your door open by saying, if you ever have more questions, I'm happy to talk about it, right? So being available. And also being available in terms of your attention, right? We often, young people get a lot of flack for being engaged with their devices, right? Or being focused on their friends or on their, you know, whatever. versus what we want them to be focused on, we as adults, right, also can get just as sucked into our devices or into our what's going on for us at work or with other family members. So making sure that your attention is also available, right, that you have the capacity to be emotionally available, be attentively available to young people as well. Avoiding shame and judgment, right? We sometimes use this as a group agreement with young people, this idea of not yucking anyone's yum. What we mean by that is that we don't want to shame young people for what they're into. So I always just tell people to avoid calling anything disgusting, silly, weird, stupid, icky, whatever, because we just don't know, right? We just don't know. And what we say about other people's behavior, our young people are picking up as what we might say about their behavior, even if it's not the same behavior. Validate and empathize. I can't say this enough times. We want to stay present. We want to avoid minimizing feelings or experiences. Just because young people are young doesn't mean that their feelings or experiences are any less important or any less valid or any less real to young people, right? So we want to validate that. Offering additional resources and getting education for ourselves as adults is really important. We are often used to being the expert as adults, right? Or the primary resource for our kids, especially when they're small. As they grow older, we need to let go of the need to be the expert or the only resource. It is helpful to identify other safe adults that you trust and offer those folks as resources to your kids. Maybe have a conversation with them and say, hey, like, I'd love to offer you as like another adult my kid could go to. Are you cool with that? Like maybe it's maybe one of your siblings, so maybe one of their aunts and uncles or a family friend or whatever, and making sure that young people have those people's contact information so that if they want to reach out, those people are available. You can also, right, do some learning on your own about some of these topics. We sometimes feel like, well, young people know so much about this and I don't know anything, but that doesn't mean that we can't do some Googling, right, on our own, and I'll share some resources for that as well. Creating rules and boundaries that age with your child, right? Nobody wants to be stuck in the same boundaries at 16 that they had when they were 12, right? We want to be able to age and grow. Things to think about around that, things like curfew, media, tech use, right? Things like that, thinking about how can our boundaries change over time as our children change over time. And being curious, right? Like, what are you thinking about that? Not assuming that our role as the adult is to tell young people how to be. It's our role to be curious about their experience and sort of approach from a place of curiosity. So like I said, that's kind of thinking big picture tactics, right? So being available, avoiding shame, validating their experiences, offering resources, aging with our child, being curious. And then this is thinking a little bit more about tactics, right? So what do I actually say in the moment when I'm engaged with my kid to lean into some of those strategies? So I'm just going to offer a few, and we'll circle back to these through some scenario practice as well. So one of my faves, wonder aloud. Wondering aloud is a great alternative to a direct question. So this is an example of something you could say, right? So in this situation, you're noticing that perhaps your child is in a relationship that doesn't seem to be working for them in some way. I wonder if relationships are sometimes different than what we expect them to be. Your kid doesn't have to answer you. Your kid doesn't have to say, yeah, this is what I thought it was going to be, and here's how it's different, and this is why I'm disappointed. You're just offering the perspective that perhaps things might be different than what we thought. This is a great way to sort of like plant an idea without putting any direct pressure on a young person to have an immediate answer or an immediate response. We can always circle back. They may not respond to you at all. We'll talk about it in a scenario later. They may be like, ew, oh my God, like, please stop talking, right? That doesn't mean they didn't hear what you said. That just means they don't want to talk about it with you. But the wondering aloud, right, doesn't require a response. They're not like refusing to answer your question. They're just not responding to what you said. Empathize. So this is a relatively, right, this is a common skill we hear about in active listening. Empathizing means like noticing the emotionality, right? Noticing the feeling that someone is experiencing and being connected to that feeling. That stinks. Also around excitement, like, oh my gosh, how exciting, right? When a young person is really excited about something, we can join them in that excitement. We can empathize with their experience, which shows them that, which is offering an opportunity for connectedness, right? Sometimes we also talk about attunement, right? So seeing where someone else is at and then matching, right? Matching. So if something really disappointing happens, joining them in that disappointment, like that really stinks. And just sitting in it, right? Not trying to problem solve, not trying to find the solution, just sitting and acknowledging the feeling, right? Empathizing with the feeling. Observing patterns. So this is sort of like one of the cool things about being the adult around a young person is that we have the capacity to zoom out, right? One of the things that is cool about young people is that they're really great at like being very present in the moment, right? They're very much in the here and now a lot of the time, and seeing things in the future, right, sometimes can be hard for them. That's cool because it means they experience the present really vividly. It can be challenging because it means sometimes they have trouble, right, seeing the future, right, a little bit, seeing where something is going. As an adult in a young person's life, we have this ability to sort of do that zooming out role, right, and observing a pattern or noticing a pattern for somebody. And so we can offer that observation. Again, it's not telling someone what to do. It's not telling them how to be. It's not forcing them to respond to you or to do something different. It's just observing the pattern. So in this example, it seems like Katie is often frustrated when you can't talk because of homework. So noticing a conflict cycle. So maybe this is a friend who's like always wanting to text your kid, and then they get into these fights because your kid is taking a couple of AP classes and they really need to focus on their work. And so then there's always this fight about like not being available. And just noticing that, right? It seems like this is happening a lot. And then stopping and then not talking after that, right? So just providing the observation and then just seeing what the response might be. Soy. Soy is one of my all-time favorites. It is just a sentence structure. It just stands for some people, other people, you might. This is a great tactic for avoiding that shame and judgment that I just talked about. It provides an option, right? A menu of options, right? A sort of lots of different ways to be. So the example that's in here is some people figure out their identity sooner, other people take a little bit longer. You might be in one of those groups or somewhere in the middle. Another example I've given to folks before is around like the college process. Like some people want to go to school at a really large school that's far away. Other people might want to attend something smaller, something that's a little bit closer to home. You might be in either of those camps, or you might not be sure yet. All of that is okay, right? So just providing permission to be wherever you are and wherever you might be. Yes, soy is like my go-to. I love soy. And there's tons of different opportunities to use soy, right? Often this is a good moment when young people are asking for like what we might call it like a permission seeking question. Like, is it okay if I blank? Or like, so is it okay if I want to go to a school that's nearer to my home? Is it okay if I haven't figured out who I am yet? And so this is like, yeah, all the things are okay. It's okay if you have, it's okay if you haven't, different ways to be. And then the last one on here, which is really connected to empathizing, right, is this idea of validating feelings. And I put validating feelings, right, because it's important to know that we can always validate the feeling, even if we don't agree with the content. So we can always validate how someone feels, even if we don't agree with the argument that they're making. So I'm going to use this bottom example first. So this idea of it feels so unfair that you can't do what your friends are doing. It's a great example, right, of when you might have a boundary or a rule in your home that's not the same as your kids' friends. And so, this is like, all my friends are doing this, but you won't let me, kind of conversation. And we can validate the experience of how unfair it feels when it feels like everyone else is getting to do something that you don't get to do. Like, that sucks. If I was in a group of people and everybody else got ice cream and I didn't get any ice cream, I would be really frustrated about that. Like, it feels really unfair. And so we can validate that experience of how unfair that is without saying, and so it's okay that you do XYZ thing, right? It feels so unfair that you can't do what your friends are doing. I get that. And this is the boundary, and here's why. right? So holding that both and of validating someone's feelings, but also right, holding your boundary. The first one on here, right, it's frustrating when I keep messing up the pronouns, right? Again, just validating the feeling that someone's having, feeling frustrated, feeling unfair, things like that. Questions, I'm going to pause for a second. Questions in the chat about any of these strategies or tactics, or other tactics that maybe you feel connected to or strongly about, that speak into that. Give folks a second to think about that. Or scenarios. I wish I'd learned these. Well, great. I'm glad that we're learning them now. But always still time to put them into use. So seeing someone in here saying, boy, oh yeah, I can see these, but y'all can't. Wish I'd learned these 10 years ago. Someone else saying same. Cool. Any scenarios where it feels like these would be difficult to use, or you're like, I can't imagine doing that, or I'm not sure how I would do that in this situation? Folks, a second. Talking about with fear, can you say a little bit more about like when people are you saying like when young people are afraid, or when you are afraid? The person who talked about that. And then I saw somebody else talking about using TV and these tactics. Yeah, right. So using some of these things like wondering aloud around media, for sure, right? So you're watching something on TV and then you can wonder about that. Yes. Okay. So this person talking about it. So that sometimes it's difficult to do this when you have fear around a young person's behavior, right? Yeah, absolutely. Right. So if we are feeling fearful, right, again, because we have that sort of ability to see things that the young person might not be seeing, right? So we can see these sort of potential outcomes that might be potentially harmful or potentially frightening. For us, it gets really hard to go into these tactics, right? Because they're non-directive, right? That's what all of these have in common, is that none of them are directive. They're not saying what you should be doing. They're not telling people how to be. They're really providing this sort of menu of options. They're really providing this sort of like, however you are is cool, right? And what's important about these tactics is that they're affirming the individual, right? They're affirming who somebody is. It doesn't mean that we can't set boundaries around behavior. And this person in the chat also talking about offering other resources and letting the child choose did work, but it was really hard. And I think that's so important to acknowledge how hard that is for us as adults when we genuinely care about the young person and we are concerned about them. And so I think absolutely wanting to make sure that we as adults are getting our own supports too, right? So that we can sit in that discomfort and can sit in that fear and anxiety. Also seeing one other person in the chat saying, when you've gone a long time without using these tactics, there can be a great level of skepticism on the part of the child. The kids will watch to ensure you're consistent. Yeah, for sure, right? So if we like have been doing a lot of really directive engagement and then we start shifting to this less directive way of being, young people might be skeptical. And that's okay. Like, that makes sense that they're skeptical, right? We could name that. We could just be like, I wonder, like, that's a wonder aloud moment. Like, I wonder how, like, if you're worried that I'm not actually going to follow through on this, they might not respond to that, but we can acknowledge it. Also seeing one other person in the chat talking about fear. One way with fear is to think about the idea of a warm demander as a teacher, validate but offer choices, challenge their assumptions while still validating their feelings. Yeah, absolutely. So let's like play this out in a couple of scenarios, right? These ideas. Thanks everyone for putting that stuff in the chat. Feel free to keep dropping stuff in there as we go along. So when we talk about boundaries with young people, I always encourage us to remember about how we as human people learn about our boundaries. And I'm thinking boundaries in this way in lots of different examples, right? So body boundaries, boundaries around our relationships, basically what's okay with us and what's not okay with us. How do we learn about that? The first way, right, that's maybe more obvious, is some self-reflection. What do I know that I like and don't like? So for example, I don't like it when people come up behind me without announcing themselves because I have a really intense startle reflex and it's really uncomfortable. That's a boundary. I know that about myself. You might have boundaries around types of relationships, time spent together. Somebody might have boundaries around what gets shared with other people. So in terms of thinking about like sexual activity, right? Someone might have a boundary around like, I don't want you to talk about this with your friends, right? Or I'm going to share this with you, but I don't want you to tell other people. And that could be in a friendship as well, right? Like I want to tell you this personal thing about myself, but I don't want you to share that with other people. So sometimes we can do some self-reflection to think about what we might be comfortable with or what we might not be comfortable with. That's great. It's also probably not the most common way that we actually learn what our boundaries are. Much more commonly, we learn about our boundaries through experimentation. We often don't know what our boundaries are until we run into them. And this is normal and it is okay. This is often very frightening for young people. They often feel like when we do healthy relationships workshops, they often assume that they are supposed to know what all of their boundaries are before they show up to the relationship or before they show up to the conversation. And so then when they get in a situation and they realize something is uncomfortable, they worry that something is wrong with them because they didn't know before they got there. And I think that's really, really important. And so ways we can help young people figure out their boundaries, right? Or sort of move through these scenarios where they might be running into boundary conflict with other people is again, this piece of observing patterns, right? So this helps with that self-reflection piece. So help them identify patterns in their own behavior, to name their own boundaries. You don't seem to like it when this happens. Here's an observation that I'm making. Like, I'm noticing that you're getting really tense when this is happening, right? Some of this observational stuff. We can wonder aloud. I always talk about this idea of like an internal stop sign, right? Helping young people figure out what their internal stop sign is in relationships. I wonder how you'll know when something is making you uncomfortable. They don't have to tell you what that is, right? They don't have to tell you that like they know that they're uncomfortable because like their hands feel hot. Like you don't necessarily need to know that. But it's important that they have done some self-reflection around it, right? So that they have some internal awareness around what's comfortable or uncomfortable for them. And then this last piece is validating and empathizing that it's okay to change your mind. Sometimes we think we want to do something and then we realize we're uncomfortable. And we can always speak up when that happens. And so when I teach young people, the example that I provide to them, which I think is helpful, is I always ask, so how many people in this room have ever been to a restaurant, looked at a menu, saw something that they like thought they were going to love? They were like, this is going to be so tasty and delicious. And then they got it and they tried it and they hated it. And everybody raises their hand because everybody's had that experience of like, that was just not as good as it looked in the picture. Or it wasn't as good as it sounded. And then I ask how many people actually said anything about the fact that they didn't like what they ordered. And everyone looks at me like, no, I don't say that, right? And some people do, right? Some people feel very confident advocating for themselves in that case. But many people feel very, very frightened that they can't change their mind, right? They can't say, ooh, I actually didn't like that. I'm going to need something else. And so we want to validate that it's okay to change our mind, right? That sometimes we think we want something and then we don't. And so recognizing that that's it's an okay thing to happen and that we want to validate that experience. So thinking about some of these things, well, I guess let me back up for a second. Any thoughts or questions about the thing I just said? I'm trying to go back, but I'm having a hard time figuring out how to do it. There we go. Anybody? Yeah, so someone feeling the restaurant comparison. Yeah, very common. I mean, I do that. I'm like, oh, this is not good, but I'm just going to suffer through it because I said I wanted it. And so now I'm stuck. This feeling of being stuck in our preferences. Give folks one more second to jot down any other thoughts. Cool. Okay, seems like that's resonating with a couple of people. So let's look at just a specific scenario looking at a high schooler. So your high schooler, Alex, has just started dating Christine. It's Alex's first relationship. They spend lots of time together at school. They hang out on the weekends. you're noticing that Alex hasn't seen friends in a while, and you're worried that Alex is too wrapped up in this new relationship. I'm going to give folks like 2 minutes to think about one strategy you might use in this situation. So what might we say to Alex? What might we do for Alex? Drop it in the chat for me. It's like one thing we might do. Folks, 10 more seconds to jot their thought. Okay, I'm going with that people are thinking really hard. Yes. Ooh, great wonder aloud statement happening in the chat. Yeah, I wonder if when someone has a new relationship, their old friends might miss them. Or I wonder if, and one way I might think about even shifting that a little bit is I wonder if you miss your friends. Like, I wonder if you miss spending some time with your friends. So, right, we always can start from this place, and you'll notice this is a theme here, right? Always starting from the place of validating and empathizing. We always want to affirm the importance of relationships. We are relational beings as humans, right? And so even though young people are young people, their relationships are just as important to them and just as valid to them as our adult relationships are to us. And so even if we can see coming from a mile away that this relationship is going to blow up, right? That doesn't mean that young person isn't experiencing it as real, valid, and important. And so we need to make sure that we're validating that. So like, it seems like you're really enjoying your time with Christine, right? Just like validating that. That's awesome. But we could get curious, right? How are things going? Just like get curious about the experience. Is dating how you thought it would be, right? We talked about this as this person's first relationship. If that feels too direct, these could both be wonder aloud statements, right? I wonder how things are going with Christine. I wonder if dating is how you expected. You can also, right, this is circling back to that idea of boundaries that age with your child, right? So you can also create boundaries in your home to help Alex practice setting boundaries on their own, right? So if you're feeling like Alex doesn't yet have the capacity to set boundaries for themselves, right, that feel like they're working for them, you can try helping them set some boundaries their own. That doesn't mean Alex is going to love that. I'm not like trying to pretend like this is going to be Alex's favorite thing that you're going to do this. But you could have a phone-free dinner. You could have like one night off a weekend. You could do something like, if it feels like maybe you're worried about it's impacting schoolwork in some way, right? You could suggest that they like do their schoolwork without a phone, right? If you feel like there's like too much texting or something. So thinking about different ways, right, to set some boundaries to scaffold, right? Sometimes we think about it as scaffolding, right? Helping Alex build their own capacity and tolerance for boundary setting. Because I think, right, many of us, even us grown people, struggle with boundary setting because we worry about disappointing others, right? Not just because we are like, right, it's not necessarily just that Alex wants to be with Christine all the time, although that might be true. It may also be true that Alex is worried that if Alex sets any boundaries with Christine, that Christine will leave, right? Or that it might be disappointing in some way. And so we as the adult, right, can take some of the heat for that, right? And say, we're going to set the boundary so that Alex can have the experience of having a boundary without having to own it all themselves, right? Until they can get to a place where they're more able to tolerate the discomfort of holding that boundary. So that's just like one way to think about some of these pieces. So I want to offer us one other scenario. This is written for an 8th grader, but we could take it to the next level. But I think the concepts in here are still relevant. So I wasn't sure if we were going to have younger teens too. So your 8th grader, Crystal, has her first boyfriend, James. You know that Crystal and James have had their first kiss. You're not sure if Crystal has thought about her boundaries. So thinking about this moment of like, what are Crystal's boundaries? What does this look like? Always start with validating, right? So we can always validate the relationship and Crystal's feelings. we can also be blunt about our concerns, right? If you have really specific concerns about what's happening, and I think that was speaking into the fear component that someone was talking about earlier, like this is some sample text. I actually pulled this from our clinical director and her conversation with one of her kids, but I know you and James kissed. Have you thought about going any further? James might have thought about touching your body in other ways, and it's important to think about what you're comfortable with. I wonder how you might know what you're ready for. Crystal's response to this is probably going to be like, ew, oh my God, please stop talking to me about this. Like, ugh. And then like slam the door in your face. Totally cool. The important part here, right? The thing that you're genuinely concerned about is whether or not Crystal has thought about some of these things, right? So you're sort of doing that predicting the future piece, that observing future life. And so just because you don't get a response in the moment doesn't mean you haven't planted the seed, right? So this is just a way to think about that. I always encourage folks to avoid extremes that forbid certain behaviors, right? So it is never constructive because you can't enforce it, right? You can't say like, you can't do anything but kiss this person. If you say that, like, you don't know what they're going to do, right? Like, you don't know, you can't necessarily control what behaviors they are or aren't going to engage in. So trying other kinds of rules, like you have to keep the door open, or having them be in a public space, which you casually walk through from time to time. I would make noise on your way into the room, right? Because you don't want to catch people unawares. And absolutely seeing in the chat from Lisa too, right? That if we forbid certain behaviors, what that does, right, is that is a straight up slamming your door in their face around talking with you about any of the things about those behaviors that they've said that they won't do, right? So if they do that, then they won't tell you, which, especially if we're talking about sexual behavior, right, opens up a lot of risk around health. So if our young people are engaging in sexual behaviors and they're not sharing that with us, but they need health care around their sexual health, so STI testing, pregnancy testing, birth control, abortion care, right, any of those things, or anything related with an unintended pregnancy, right? We want to make sure that we're keeping our doors open so that if they need those resources, that we are an available resource to them, right? Any thoughts or questions about those two scenarios that folks are sitting with? Give folks a second to jot those down before we move to our next place, talking about tech. Okay, so just a note about thinking about boundaries in tech, right? So when you are thinking about boundary setting, I always just encourage folks to make sure that they think about boundaries related to tech, right? So whether that's phone use, whether that is like sending pictures, right, or things like that. It is important to have a conversation about the risks of sharing sexual content via apps or online, right? Like, young people need to know that there are risks associated with that. It doesn't mean that they'll never do it just because you talk about, right, again, circling back to that idea around forbidding behaviors. That doesn't mean that just because you talk about the risk, they're never going to do it. So I think just being mindful about that. But talking about, like, here's the potential, here are the things that could happen, right? There are legal risks associated with that. There are certainly social risks associated with that. It's vulnerable, right? Sharing any part of ourselves with somebody else is vulnerable. It's trusting someone else. And so anytime we're vulnerable, there's some amount of risk. So thinking about those pieces. I always put in a note about porn, right? So that porn is intended for entertainment. It is not a how-to manual. One of my very favorite sexuality educators, Dawn Ravine at Lurie's, always talks about, gives the metaphor of you wouldn't teach your child how to, or somebody wouldn't learn how to drive by watching Fast and Furious. Similar concept here, right? We're not going to learn how to have sex by watching porn. And making sure that people know, like, our young people know that that's not realistic, right? Porn is a good moment, right? Depending on what your values are in your own house, right? And different families have different values around porn. Some people engage in porn. Some people watch porn. Other people don't watch porn. You might or you might not, but I want you to know that porn isn't a realistic portrayal of how sex is a good soy statement around porn that you might want to throw in there. And you can set boundaries in your home around tech use. It is okay to do that. I would just like to validate that that's an okay thing to do. But they should, again, right, circling back to that idea of they should age with your child, right? So the boundaries that you have for your child at 12, at 13 are different than what you're going to have at 16, 17, 18. Thinking about how that might change. Questions or thoughts or scenarios that folks are wondering around some of this tech stuff? I know that sometimes this is a place where people have questions or concerns about talking about it. Okay. Ooh. All right. So then shifting gears a little bit, right? So that was kind of thinking about boundaries and relationships. I want to talk a little bit about sexual and gender identity development and how parents can support young people in terms of thinking about this. So reminder, identity development happens over time. I know we have some professionals in this space. This probably looks familiar to you. The model of stages of psychosocial development by Erickson, right? That identity development is something that happens throughout our entire lifespan. When we look specifically at adolescence, right? So if we're talking about adolescence, that's this little turquoise square. This question about who am I, right? This identity question is the fundamental question of adolescence. It is just all about identity. At the same time, right, adolescents are starting to begin to have the capacity to move from either or thinking into both and thinking. So, right, either or thinking meaning something's right or it's wrong, it's good or it's bad, it's this way or it's that way. And moving away from that kind of either or thinking into both and thinking, right? That's soy, right? That soy statement is a both and, right? So people both enjoy this and some people enjoy this. And neither one of those is right or wrong or good or bad. They're just two ways, two different things that are true at the same time. And this sort of intersection, right, of this real intense search for identity and this beginning to have this capacity to move from really concrete either or thinking into this more expansive both and thinking can create a really challenging environment, right? There's a lot of comparison, a lot of judgments, a lot of assumptions, and a lot of reactivity. And working through that, both in terms of a peer environment, right? How this can happen in peer groups when we see young people being unkind to one another, right? But also in terms of the way that they react to us as adults, right? A lot of reactivity to now you're telling me I can't do it this way and that makes you bad, right? Or whatever. And so it's important to remember, right, that that's developmental in some ways. And this also intersects, right, when we talk about specifically talking about gender identity and sexual identity development, we can also look at it this way too. So in terms of gender, right, and our kids' gender identity, we know that children as young as 3 to 5 years old can understand gender and their own gender identity. So that's pretty small, right? That's preschool, or even before that. That doesn't mean, right, that every person is necessarily using words like cisgender and transgender to talk about their gender identity at that age range. But it does mean, right, that they can have a sense of I'm a girl, I'm a boy, I'm neither of those things, and be able to talk about that. All of that stuff, right, gets then revisited during adolescence, which is why we often see, right, young people who might share a trans identity or share that they're exploring their gender identity. The other sort of like hot time for that, right, is adolescence. And so that's something that can come up then as well. Sexual identity development, right, or who we like, occurs at the onset of puberty, right? So what that means is that when we first start developing, right, this is how I explain it to young people, when we first start moving from our childhood bodies into our adulthood bodies, right, through puberty, that is when we first start to experience crushes on other people. So an average age of 10 is this idea of sexual identity sort of awareness, right? The sense of like, ooh, like I get the fluttery feelings about that person in my class. However, we know that for our LGB young people, right? So young people who might have same gender sexual attraction, they often don't disclose that identity until later. but sometimes earlier. So just thinking about our LGBTQ youth program, our fastest growing group is our elementary and middle school group. So looking at fifth grade through 7th grade right now. And so that's when we see this sort of sexual identity development happen. What we know is that parent support is the #1 predictor of positive outcomes for LGBTQ plus young people. And so that's true both for LGBTQ plus young people, right? But when they don't have parent support, the other thing that makes a really big difference is adult support outside of their parents, right? So other supportive adults, which means that you as a grown person in young people's lives have a really important role to play, both in terms of supporting your own children, but also in terms of supporting their peers. And so what does that look like? So some ways to think about this, right? And creating a more LGBTQ inclusive home. So using affirmed names and pronouns and gender inclusive and neutral language. When we say affirmed name and pronouns, what we mean is the name that people want to be called or the pronouns people want to be called. So some examples of gender inclusive language, right? We might ask if someone is dating someone versus having a boyfriend or a girlfriend. You can try introducing yourself with your pronouns to let other people know that they can share them with you. So for example, my name's Lizzie, my pronouns are she and her, which gives other people the option to share theirs. It's important that we make it clear that disrespectful or oppressive language is not acceptable, right? And speak up if we hear or see something. So if we hear our young people or hear young people in our space making comments about LGBTQ identities that are hurtful or harmful, we want to address that in the moment, right? And say something of like maybe an observation, right? I'm surprised to hear you say that because I know that you value respect for other people. Or I wonder what was happening for you when you said that. I know that can be hurtful to some people. We want to protect privacy, right? We never want to share someone's sexual or gender identity without their permission. And same thing goes for young people, that we don't want to out them without their permission either. We can always show visual signs of welcome, whether that's flags or colors or pins or whatever. And then just talking about LGBTQ news or stories or characters, right? Highlighting that can be an important way to signal that we're welcoming and inclusive in our space. So I wanted to, before I go there, any thoughts or questions about all of the things that I just shared in terms of identity development around gender and sexuality, or around ways we can provide support, or questions or thoughts? Where you look at a scenario in terms of your friend, in terms of your child sharing something with you. Give folks a second. Cool. Okay. Doing my count to 10 in my head. All right. So looking at a scenario here, talking specifically about this experience. So your child, Kate, tells you that her friend Ray is now going by Rachel and using they, them pronouns. She also shares that her other friend, Crystal, is pansexual. You're not sure what all these words mean or why Kate is telling you. So how might you respond to Kate in this moment? So Kate's telling you a lot of information about other people, and you're trying to think about how to respond in this moment. What might you say to Kate? Give folks 15 seconds to type their response. I will count in my head for you. Okay, 2 more seconds. So I don't want to say the wrong thing. So I'm wondering if that is a thing that someone would say or a thing that you are feeling, Olivia. Either way is okay. Yeah, I'm curious what it means to be pansexual. What I'm feeling. Yeah. So that's really real. I appreciate you sharing that, Olivia, that piece of like this, actually, I'm just worried I'm going to say the wrong thing, which is probably how you might feel in that moment. So other people just being like, tell me more, right? Absolutely. I don't know what some of those things are. So always a solid thanks for telling me, right? I threw in I'll need to practice Rachel's pronouns. What are you thinking about it, right? All the things that folks said are right on. I think someone else said like pansexual, like I haven't heard that word before. Like, can you tell me a little bit more about what that means? So just owning your curiosity, right? Owning what you don't know. It is also okay to need some time to absorb new identities, right? This young person, so just to like hypothesize this from a couple of perspectives, right? Kate might be telling you this because Kate is having a hard time absorbing all of this information. Like maybe some of this is new to her and she's like, wow, like there's a lot. So we can just like validate that experience, that it's going to take some time. We don't want to assume that our kids have all the answers, right? Some young people do know a tremendous amount of about sexual and gender identities, right? Some of them are like walking dictionaries of sexual and gender identity terms. Not every young person knows a lot about LGBTQ identities, and so they may also not know about what it means to be pansexual to the person who asked that, right? So one thing we might do is just be like, wow, like I'm curious about what it means to be pansexual. Do you know, or should we look that up, right? Just to validate that they may not know. And just being some curiosity, right? A lot of the things folks said were really leaning into curiosity. Yeah, totally. Seeing Lisa also talking about making sure that we're not accidentally questioning Ray or Crystal, right? So I always tell people to avoid why questions. So we don't want to say, why would Rachel do that? Or why is Crystal pansexual? Or what are you trying, right? Because that sounds like you don't believe them, right? Versus saying things like, that term's new to me, I want to learn more, right? Just like leaning into that piece. A good moment for soy, right? Some people figure out their identity sooner, other people learn about themselves later. Like you might be in either of those camps. How are you feeling about all of this? Like, thanks for sharing, right? Those pieces around taking in the information, because it's also possible, right? So one possibility is that Kate is trying to sort it out. The other possibility is that Kate is telling you this to try to figure out how you're going to react when Kate tells you something about Kate's identities, right? Which you may have a sense of that already, right? If that's something that you may already have observed some of that yourself. But I think it's important to remember, right, that even if Kate isn't exploring sexual or gender identity, the way that you respond to Kate's peers being different in any way, right? Kate will see that and feel how you might respond to Kate being different in any way, right? So how you respond to difference, right? Just difference in general, how you respond to difference sends a message to your child about how you're going to respond to them when they are different in some way, right? And every child is going to be different in some way. They're going to be different from you because they're a different person and everybody's different from each other. So thinking about validating, right? Validating difference, expressing curiosity about difference, but validating that difference is okay and that it's normal and that it's a part of our human experience is important for sending the message to your kid that whoever they are, you accept them for who they are, right? Whether that's because they're exploring an LGBTQ identity or because you love football and they just hate it and they're worried that you're going to be grumpy that they hate football or whatever. That's a low-key example, but just thinking about different ways that might be. Other questions or thoughts either about that scenario or any of the things that we've talked about today, because we're almost at the end of time. So questions or thoughts folks are sitting with. People a second to think about it. Great, Gwen's feeling it. Thanks, Gwen. I also put on here too, and folks feel free to type questions if you're still thinking about them, but if you want to reach out to me, you are always welcome to do that. I'm happy to chat individually or answer follow-up questions, or if you're thinking about different things or you're just like, this is the scenario I'm thinking about, like happy to talk through it. But also if you want to access the slides, this is the link to do that. I can also like type it out so it's a real link in the chat. So that you are welcome to access those at your leisure if you'd like to. And I think if no one is typing any questions, I'm going to assume that means they don't have them. So I think I'm going to hand it back to Olivia unless someone surprises me.
Yes, and I'm agreeing with everyone in the chat. I mean, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful information. Lizzie, thank you so much. I think that we're all walking away with information that we can use. I mean, when we walk out the door today. So thank you so much. And please, take advantage of those slides. Following the webinar, I will get this information from Lizzie and make sure that I send that out to everyone so that you have that. So thank you again, everyone. And if there are no other questions, you are free to go.
Thanks, y'all.